Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a book that's stirred up a lot of controversy over the years.
Oh, yeah.
The Myth of the 20th Century by Alfred Rosenberg.
It's a big one.
It is a big one. Get ready for some mind-bending concepts because we're about to explore a worldview that shaped history in some pretty profound ways.
It's fascinating how a book that was once so influential is now largely unread and misunderstood. It's like a historical time capsule,
Yeah.
offering a glimpse into the anxieties
Right.
and aspirations of a very specific era.
And it's not just some dusty old relic. Rosenberg was a leading figure in the National Socialist movement in Germany.
Right.
So his ideas had real-world impact. His book, first published in 1930, went through multiple editions reflecting the changing political landscape. But at its core, it grapples with some pretty weighty questions about race, culture, and the fate of civilizations.
Yeah, it's crucial to understand the historical context here. Rosenberg was writing in the aftermath of World War I, a period of immense social and political upheaval. Europe was grappling with economic instability, rising nationalism, and a deep sense of uncertainty about the future.
Right.
His book, with its focus on the myth of the blood, offered a powerful and, as we know, dangerous explanation for the challenges of the time.
Okay, so let's break down this myth of the blood. It's a central idea in the book.
Yeah.
And to be honest, it can be a bit confusing. Rosenberg uses myth differently than we might typically think. He doesn't mean a made-up story.
Right.
He sees it as a literal truth,
Yes.
a fundamental force shaping human history. Imagine it like a nation's spirit or destiny, but with a very specific racial component.
Exactly. For Rosenberg, the myth of the blood is all about the belief that race, specifically the Aryan race, is the driving force behind all great civilizations. He saw the Aryan race as possessing unique qualities and abilities that made them superior to other races.
And just to be clear, we are in no way endorsing these ideas.
Oh, of course.
They've been thoroughly debunked and have no place in a modern understanding of human diversity.
Right.
But to grasp the impact of Rosenberg's work, we need to understand the beliefs he was putting forth.
Right. It's like trying to understand a historical event without knowing the motivations of the key players.
Right.
It doesn't make it right, but it helps us see how things unfolded.
So who were these Aryans, according to Rosenberg? And how did this idea of Aryan supremacy influence his views on other groups?
Rosenberg believed the Aryan race was responsible for all the major cultural achievements in history,
Wow.
from the ancient civilizations of India and Persia to the Greeks and Romans. He pointed to physical characteristics like light skin, hair, and eyes as evidence of this racial superiority. But it wasn't just about physical traits.
You mentioned something about a racial soul. What did Rosenberg mean by that?
Right. He believed that each race possessed a kind of collective spirit,
Okay.
a racial soul that shaped their culture and values. And he saw the Aryan racial soul as being particularly attuned to creativity, innovation, and spiritual insight.
I'm starting to see how this line of thinking could lead to some pretty dangerous conclusions.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. Rosenberg's ideas about Aryan supremacy took a dark turn when he started talking about other races, most notably the Jewish people.
This is where Rosenberg's theories become especially disturbing. He labeled the Jewish people an anti-race,
Right.
seeing them as a threat to the purity and advancement of Aryan civilization.
He actually claimed that the Jewish people originated in the Middle East
Yeah.
and migrated to Europe much later than the so-called Aryan people. He argued that their presence in Europe was disruptive and that they had a negative influence on various aspects of society, particularly in areas like finance, politics, and culture.
Again, it's essential to be clear that we're not endorsing these views in any way.
Right.
They are deeply rooted in prejudice and have been widely refuted. But understanding these beliefs is crucial for grappling with the impact of Rosenberg's work.
Okay, so we've talked about race, but how did Rosenberg's ideas about the myth of the blood influence his views on religion, specifically Christianity? I'm curious to know how he reconciled this idea of Aryan supremacy with a religion that, at its core, teaches love and compassion for all.
That's a great question. Rosenberg had a very complex and often contradictory relationship with Christianity.
Yeah.
You might be surprised to learn that he wasn't entirely dismissive of it.
Oh, okay.
He saw certain elements within the Christian tradition as being compatible with his concept of the Nordic spirit.
What sorts of elements?
Well, he pointed to figures like St. Francis and Brother Angelico,
Okay.
who he saw as embodying a kind of pure spirituality that was untainted by what he perceived as negative Jewish influences.
So he was cherry-picking the parts of Christianity that fit his worldview.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Rosenberg was highly critical of Christianity as a whole.
Mm.
He believed that its adoption of Jewish ideas, which he considered to be inferior, had corrupted its original message. He saw it as a symptom of racial and cultural decline.
This reminds me of how he viewed the ancient Greeks, who he admired for their achievements, but
Yeah.
also saw as a cautionary tale of racial mixing and decline. It's like he was constantly searching for historical examples to validate his ideas about racial purity.
That's a really astute observation. Rosenberg's historical analysis was very much driven by his predetermined conclusions. He cherry-picked evidence to fit his narrative, and often ignored or dismissed anything that contradicted his views.
Okay, so we've covered Rosenberg's ideas about race and religion, but there's another interesting concept he explores: the distinction between honor and love. How do these ideas fit into his overall philosophy?
For Rosenberg, honor was the superior guiding principle,
Okay.
especially for those he considered to be of the Nordic Germanic culture. He saw it exemplified in figures like the Vikings, who he believed embodied a spirit of courage, strength, and loyalty.
And he contrasted this with the Christian concept of love, which he saw as weak and detrimental to the preservation of racial purity.
Exactly. He argued that love in its Christian interpretation led to a blurring of boundaries between groups, a mixing of races, and a weakening of what he saw as the essential characteristics of the Aryan spirit.
So, for Rosenberg, honor was about maintaining a strict hierarchy, preserving racial purity, and upholding a very specific set of values that he associated with strength and vitality. While love, in his view, represented a kind of dangerous egalitarianism that threatened to undermine the natural order he envisioned.
That's a great way to put it. And these distinctions between honor and love are key to understanding Rosenberg's worldview and his critique of modern society, which we'll explore further in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we've established that Rosenberg had some, let's say, unconventional ideas about race and religion. But how did he apply those ideas to his interpretation of history? I'm curious to see how he twisted the narrative to fit his worldview.
Well, buckle up, because Rosenberg's version of history is a wild ride. He starts way back, like tens of thousands of years ago, claiming that the earliest known artworks and musical instruments were created by early Germanics, his term for the ancestors of the Aryan race. He even points to ivory flutes and figurines as evidence.
So he's basically saying that the very first artists were Aryan.
Exactly. And of course, this fits perfectly into his narrative of Aryan supremacy. He's arguing that the impulse to create, to express oneself artistically, is inherent in the Aryan bloodline.
But how does he explain the existence of other cultures and civilizations? Surely he doesn't believe that Aryans were responsible for everything.
Oh, he definitely tries to connect the dots in ways that, shall we say, stretch the imagination. For example, he talks about how these early Germanics, who he also calls Nordics, were the ones who survived the last ice age in Europe. He even claims that the first light-skinned people appeared in the Middle East around this time.
So he's linking skin color to the Aryan race right from the start.
Absolutely. It's a central part of his racial hierarchy. And he gets even more specific, claiming that blue eyes first appeared in a group called the Western Hunter-Gatherers, who emerged in Central Europe around 19,000 years ago.
Wait, so blue eyes are a sign of Aryan ancestry. That seems pretty arbitrary.
Your catching on Rosenberg's logic is often circular. He takes traits that he associates with the Aryan race, like blue eyes or blonde hair, and then uses those traits to trace the lineage of the Aryan people back through history.
It's like he's working backwards from a conclusion he's already made.
Precisely. And this leads him to some pretty outlandish claims. For example, he argues that blonde hair first appeared in a group called the Ancient North Eurasians, who lived in North-Central Asia around 18,000 years ago. He suggests that this group played a major role in spreading Aryan traits westward.
So blonde hair originated in Asia. That's not what I learned in history class.
Well, modern genetics paints a much more complex picture of human migration and racial development. Rosenberg's theories are based on outdated science and a lot of speculation.
Okay, so let's talk about ancient Greece. You'd think Rosenberg would be all about the Greeks, given their contributions to philosophy, art, and democracy. But I have a feeling he might have a different take.
You're right to be suspicious. Rosenberg has a very ambivalent view of the Greeks. While he acknowledges their achievements, he also sees their culture as a cautionary tale of racial mixing and decline.
How so?
He argues that the original Greek civilization was established by Nordic conquerors who subjugated the native non-Aryan population. He calls these early Greeks Hellenes and claims they were warriors who built their civilization on the backs of conquered peoples.
So the golden age of Greece was actually a result of Aryan dominance.
That's Rosenberg's argument. But he believes that over time, the influx of Near Eastern influences led to racial mixing, which he saw as a weakening of the Nordic bloodlines and the ultimate cause of Greek decline.
I'm sensing a pattern here. Whenever a civilization starts to decline, Rosenberg blames it on racial mixing.
You're absolutely right. It's a recurring theme in his historical analysis. And it gets even more interesting when he talks about Athenian democracy.
I'm all ears. How does democracy fit into his racial theory?
Rosenberg sees Athenian democracy as a symptom of Greek decline. He believes it represented a shift away from the aristocratic, honor-based values of the earlier Nordic Greeks toward a more egalitarian system that deleted racial purity.
So democracy is bad because it gives power to the masses who he sees as racially inferior.
That's the gist of it. He believed that true leadership should be based on merit and ability, qualities that he, of course, attributed to the Aryan race. And he even goes so far as to criticize the philosopher Socrates.
Socrates, the father of Western philosophy. What's his beef with Socrates?
Rosenberg saw Socrates' emphasis on reason and morality as undermining the heroic, vitalistic spirit of the earlier Greeks. He believed that Socrates represented a turning point towards a more intellectual, less instinctual approach to life, which he saw as detrimental to the vitality of the Aryan race.
So thinking too much is bad for your racial purity.
According to Rosenberg, yes. He believed that true strength lay in action, in instinct, and a kind of primal energy that he associated with the Aryan bloodline. And he saw intellectualism as a corrupting force that weakened that primal energy.
Wow. Okay, so we've got Rosenberg's take on art, ancient civilizations, and even philosophy. It seems like he's trying to rewrite all of history through the lens of his racial ideology.
That's a great way to put it. He's creating a grand narrative that positions the Aryan race as the driving force of civilization while simultaneously blaming other groups for every decline and downfall.
And let's not forget his views on Christianity, which he saw as being corrupted by Jewish influences. It's all connected.
Exactly. For Rosenberg, history is a battleground between the forces of racial purity and racial corruption. And he sees his mission as reclaiming that history, reinterpreting it in a way that supports his vision of Aryan supremacy.
This is some seriously heavy stuff, and I'm guessing it doesn't end with just reinterpreting history. What kind of solutions does Rosenberg propose for the problems he sees in the world?
Well, that's a conversation for our next part. But let's just say his prescriptions for society are just as radical and, in retrospect, dangerous as his historical interpretations.
So we spent the last part talking about Rosenberg's radical views about history. And we've gone through his ideas about race, religion.
Yeah.
Now for the big question, what does he actually propose we do about all this? Because, I mean, he doesn't just diagnose the problem, right?
Well, no, of course not. He definitely offers solutions.
Okay.
And they're about as radical as his views on history.
Yeah.
Remember how he sees cities as like these hotbeds of corruption? Well, he takes that idea and runs with it, arguing for some pretty extreme measures.
Like what? Like banning people from moving to cities?
Well, he doesn't go that far.
Okay.
But he does suggest limiting migration to cities with over 100,000 inhabitants.
Okay.
He thinks that urbanization leads to racial mixing and the erosion of traditional values.
I see.
He really romanticizes rural life,
Right.
seeing it as a purer, more authentic expression of the Aryan spirit.
So it's not just about race. It's also about a way of life, like a rejection of modernity
Right.
and a yearning for a simpler, more traditional past.
Exactly. And this ties into his critiques of democracy and capitalism, which he sees as symptoms of a society that has lost its way. He argues that democracy elevates mediocrity and undermines the natural hierarchy he believes is essential for a strong society.
So he's basically saying that, like, letting the average person have a say in government is a recipe for disaster.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
He believes that leadership should be reserved for those who are naturally superior, those who embody the qualities that he associates with the Aryan race.
Right.
And he even criticizes capitalism for its focus on individual gain and material wealth.
So if he's against democracy and capitalism, what's the alternative? Is it some kind of racially pure agrarian utopia?
Yeah, in a way, yes.
Yeah.
He calls for a return to traditional values, a rejection of the decadence of modern life, and the creation of a new kind of state, one based on his racial ideology and guided by the principles of honor, duty, and service to the collective.
Okay, but who gets to decide what these traditional values are? Who leads this new state? It's not going to be a democratically elected government, is it?
You got it. Rosenberg envisions a highly authoritarian state with power concentrated in the hands of a select few, those deemed worthy based on their racial and spiritual qualities. It's a chillingly familiar recipe for oppression and tyranny.
It's scary stuff. And it's important to remember that Rosenberg wasn't just some armchair philosopher.
Yeah.
His ideas had real-world consequences. They were embraced by the National Socialist regime and used to justify horrific acts of violence and discrimination.
Yeah, the Holocaust, the systematic genocide of Jews and other minority groups, stands as a stark reminder of what can happen when extremist ideologies are put into practice. It's a dark chapter in human history, and it's inextricably linked to the ideas that Rosenberg espoused.
So what can we learn from all of this? Why should we even bother engaging with such disturbing and dangerous ideas?
Well, I think it's crucial to understand the intellectual currents that shape our world, even the ones that we find repugnant. By studying the past, even its darkest chapters, we can gain insights into the dangers of prejudice, extremism, and the abuse of power. And hopefully, we can equip ourselves to recognize and challenge these forces in our own time.
It's a sobering reminder that ideas have consequences, and that we all have a responsibility to be critical thinkers, to question assumptions, and to speak out against injustice wherever we see it.
Well said. Rosenberg's vision of a world defined by racial hierarchies ultimately failed. But the fight for equality and justice is an ongoing struggle. We must never forget the lessons of the past, and we must always be vigilant in defending the rights and dignity of all people.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a challenging journey, but hopefully an enlightening one. Keep those critical thinking caps on, and until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.